In the preface for his 2007 biography of Roosevelt, Gene Edward Smith writes, "Three presidents dominate American history: George Washington, who founded the country, Abraham Lincoln, who preserved it, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who rescued it from economic collapse and then led it to victory in the greatest war of all time." Elected for an unprecedented 4 terms, Roosevelt proved the most gifted American statesman of the 20th century. When he took office in 1933, 1/3 of the nation was unemployed, agriculture lay destitute, factories were idle, businesses were closing their doors, and the banking system teetered on the brink of collapse. Violence lay just beneath the surface. The Hoover administration had deployed tanks and tear gas to drive a bedraggled remnant of World War I veterans, the bonus marchers, from Washington, but otherwise appeared incapable of responding to the crisis. Roosevelt seized the opportunity. But how? How did this man who spent the last 23 years of his life unable to stand lift the nation out of two of its worst crises? How did this man, who Smith calls a Hudson aristocrat, son of privilege who never depended on a paycheck, find himself the champion of the common man? To answer that puzzle, we will start from the beginning. Warren Delano was born in 1809. He apprenticed himself through importing firms in Boston and New York, sailing for China by age 24. He married Catherine Robbins Lymand upon returning to the United States, and the couple sailed for China in December 1843, remaining there for 3 years. In 1851, the couple purchased a 60-acre estate that Warren named the Algonac. The Delanos at this point already had 5 children, and their seventh, a daughter named Sarah, was born on September 21st, 1854. Although Sarah and 3 older children were sent back home to resume schooling in 1864, they rejoined the family in Paris 2 years later. By 1870, Sarah had been away from home for nearly 8 years and abroad for 6. By age 18, Sarah was a regular at balls, cotillons, and dinners of New York's most fashionable bloodlines. Sarah initially was smitten with Stanford White, who, though only a year older than her, had dismal prospects as an underpaid draftsman for Boston architect Henry Hobson Richardson. White was also despised by her father, who called him the red-headed trial and found nothing that would endear him as a son-in-law. 3 years after Stanford, Sarah met James Roosevelt, the latter finding love at first sight in her. Despite the large age gap, as James was 52 and Sarah was 26, James satisfied the requirements of her family with sufficient wealth, maturity, and impeccable lineage. The couple married on October 7, 1880, and the following month sailed for Europe. In August 1881, as the Roosevelts attended services at St. Peter's Cathedral in York, the 4 months pregnant Sarah nearly fainted. Sarah entered labor, and after 26 hours and nearly dying from an overdose of chloroform, the couple's first child was born on January 30th, 1882. The boy would ultimately go 2 months without a name. James wanted to name the child after his own father, but Sarah wanted to name him after her father, Warren. Finally, Sarah proposed naming the boy after her favorite uncle, Franklin Delano. As a result of Franklin's difficult birth, Sarah was advised to avoid a second and possibly fatal pregnancy. FDR was at first schooled at home with his mother, but by age 6 attended a kindergarten on a neighboring estate. While public school children learned their ABCs in English, Franklin was challenged to master them simultaneously in French and German. FDR had few playmates, which Smith attributes as a consequence of living on a rural estate under his parents' close supervision. While small visitors were sometimes allowed to come over, none were permitted to spend the night. The Whitney sisters were invited to see Franklin, and many years later their parents died within weeks of each other and caused the pair to deal with a double inheritance tax. The older sister, Isabel, wrote to President Roosevelt to request an appointment. Although FDR enjoyed meeting an old acquaintance, he informed her he could not change New York law even as president. Isabel shook her cane and said, "You were always a nasty little boy, and now you are a nasty old man." A hallmark of FDR's childhood was traveling. The Roosevelts visited the Clevelands in the White House, James having been a contributor to Cleveland's New York gubernatorial campaign and having spent even more money on his 1884 presidential campaign. James turned down accepting a diplomatic post, but Cleveland was able to get Rosie to agree to serve as first secretary to the American legation in Vienna. Cleveland placed his hand on FDR's head, remarking, "My little man, I am making a strange wish for you. It is that you may never be President of the United States." The Roosevelts spent each summer in Campbello, a rock-bound island in Canadian waters near Maine. A year before FDR's birth, James and Sarah bought 4 acres and constructed a summer home. At 2 years old, Franklin was able to sit atop a pet donkey, and just 2 years later, he started riding one each morning with his father to oversee the estate. The young Franklin collected stamps, developing a passion in ornithology, and later being given his mother's postage stamp collection when he was 10. Smith writes, "America's confidence in FDR depended on Roosevelt's incredible confidence in himself, and that traced in large measure to the comfort, security of his childhood. As his daughter Anna put it, Granny Sarah was a martinet, but she gave father the assurance he needed to prevail over adversity. Seldom has a young child been more constantly attended and incessantly approved by his mother." Smith writes that as FDR's mind developed, he would read fast and retain facts easily. As Franklin entered Groton, he went from the center of attention of 2 doting parents to one of 110 adolescent boys living in a setting that was almost monastic. Reverend Endicott Peabody was the founder and headmaster of Groton. He wanted to create a boarding school for the sons of America's establishment that was church-affiliated. In 1883, Peabody found Groton with the help of financial assistance from family friends such as J.P. Morgan. Tuition was $500 a year, about twice of what average American families were living on. The school also had no scholarships and had Morgan on its board of trustees, as well as Episcopal Bishop of Massachusetts Philip Brooks and Dean of the Episcopal Theology Seminary William Lawrence. At Groton, each boy lived in a cubicle with a bed, bureau, rug, and chair. Although Groton differed from his upbringing, Roosevelt adjusted well, writing to his parents twice a week for the next 4 years and never once complaining about his treatment there. Groton's curriculum was classical and taught with great concern for details. Roosevelt would later say the influence of Peabody and his wife was more impactful on him than anyone besides his parents. Within a month of his arrival, FDR ranked 4th academically in a class of 19. Peabody remembered Roosevelt as a quiet, satisfactory boy of more than ordinary intelligence, taking a good position in his form, but not brilliant. Athletically, he was too slight for success. We all liked him. Smith writes that Roosevelt's 4 years at Groton provided a transition from the snuggery of familial warmth at Hyde Park, and that he both accepted Peabody's premises and made them his own. In autumn 1900, Franklin entered Harvard alongside 16 of his 18 Groton classmates. Franklin and Lathrop Brown took a 3-room suite in West Morley Court, then the latest of the Gold Coast edifices, the 2 living in the $400 a year suite for the next 4 years. President Charles W. Eliot, first appointed in 1869, led Harvard to value education in intellectual terms with little concern for either character development or private morality protection. FDR soon received news of his father suffering a severe heart attack, followed by a second one. On December 8th, James died with his family at his bedside. James' estate, roughly $300,000 or slightly over $7 million in 2007 currency, provided both Franklin and Rosie with a trust fund, while Springwood went to Sarah. 2 years earlier, Sarah's father had died, and she and her siblings inherited $1.3 million from the family estate. This became the primary source of FDR's family fortune. Franklin and Sarah were in close touch during the spring of 1901. They spent 10 weeks abroad, returning before FDR had to go back to college. It was in Paris that the mother and son learned that President William McKinley had been shot during a visit to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. 12 days later, as the pair took the Nantucket lightship on their way home, they received news that President McKinley had died, making FDR's cousin Theodore the new president. At Cambridge, FDR threw himself into frenetic activity, being elected to the editorial board of the undergraduate newspaper, the Harvard Crimson. Franklin, who would make the Crimson his central interest for the next 3 years, delighted in the prestige and responsibility that came with his membership on the board. Roosevelt was later elected managing editor of the Crimson and was in charge of handling the staff. As co-editor W. Russell Bowie remembered, in his geniality was a kind of frictionless command. FDR returned to Cambridge joined by his mother, as the winter in Hyde Park had become too melancholy. Roosevelt received his Harvard degree in 1903. Elected permanent chairman of the class committee, Roosevelt prospered intellectually in spite of winning no prizes nor making it to Phi Beta Kappa. One biographer wrote, "At Groton, Roosevelt learned to get along with his contemporaries. At Harvard, he learned to lead them. Roosevelt relished female companionship throughout his adult life, despite having spent his 14 years in Springwood distant from the opposite sex. Smith describes the men of FDR's generation as oblique, with actions such as touching or kissing being seen as risque and premarital intercourse prohibited. Roosevelt proposed 3 times to different women who caught his attention. In Cambridge, Roosevelt's first love was Frances Dana, though it is reported that FDR's mother talked him out of marriage due to Dana being Catholic and thus unacceptable to the Protestant Delanos and Roosevelts. Roosevelt was then smitten with Dorothy Quincy and afterward Alice Sohier. FDR and Alice discussed marriage at some point, with Roosevelt telling her that he wanted a large family due to his only child upbringing. Alice was alarmed by this, and not wanting to be a cow, declined marrying him. After Alice departed for Europe, Franklin met Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was born October 11, 1884. Named for both of her parents, her birth was soon followed by the marriage's collapse. She and her brother went to live with Grandmother Hall after Anna's death. Eleanor was tutored in French, German, and music, studying piano and attending classes in dance and ballet. Eleanor went to boarding school in England when she was 15 and excelled at Allenwood. She quickly became the most popular girl in school, excelling in French, German, and Italian, and writing essays and making the first team in field hockey. Eleanor sat opposite Mary Sylvester, which was considered the place of honor for the next 3 years. Smith writes that Eleanor's lack of worldly experience appealed to FDR, quoting his son Elliot as saying, "A more sophisticated woman would have scared the daylights out of him." Smith furthers that FDR adored her maturity, and as the favorite niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, marrying her would give FDR even greater access to the man he most admired. In September 1904, FDR entered Columbia Law School, living with his mother in a townhouse she rented at 200 Madison Avenue, notably just across the mansion of J.P. Morgan. On occasion, Roosevelt would meet Eleanor at Rivington House and accompany Eleanor to the tenement in which a child lived after they became ill, remarking, "My God, I didn't know anyone lived like this." For Eleanor's 20th birthday, Roosevelt presented her with a diamond engagement ring. The engagement was announced at the start of December and warmly received. President Roosevelt wrote his niece that he knew she and Franklin would face all that comes bravely and lovingly. FDR asked Endicott Peabody to preside over the wedding set for March 17, 1905. Eleanor asked her Uncle Theodore to stand in for her father as the man who would give the bride away, delighting TR, who even suggested having the wedding at the White House and personally handling all the arrangements. Ahead of their wedding, the couple attended TR's inauguration, the president having been reelected after defeating Democratic nominee Alton B. Parker in a landslide. FDR remembered, "My father and grandfather were Democrats, and I was born and brought up as a Democrat, but in 1904, when I cast my first vote for president, I voted for the Republican candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, because I thought he was a better Democrat than the Democratic candidates. If I had to do it all over again, I would not alter that vote." The wedding took place in the twin townhouses of Elizabeth Livingston Ludlow, Eleanor's great aunt, at 68 East 76th Street. After President Roosevelt gave Eleanor away, he told Franklin, "There's nothing like keeping the name in the family." TR left to find the refreshments and was followed by a crowd, and soon afterward the couple. The president had upstaged the bride and groom and stolen their audience, with even the cutting of the wedding cake failing to attract attention until TR was persuaded to get a slice. TR's daughter Alice reflected, "Father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral." Classmate William Donovan remembered Roosevelt as daring, viewing FDR as having gained enormous confidence in himself after his time at Groton and Harvard, who never let law school interfere with his personal life. The Roosevelts went to Springwood after their wedding, which contributed to the 73 absences Roosevelt recorded during his first year and his failing of 2 of his 7 courses. FDR studied over the summer and later took makeup exams in contracts and civil procedures, easily passing both. His final grades consisted of 3 Bs, 3 Cs, and a D, placing him somewhere in the middle of the class. Over the summer between the first and second year, Franklin and Eleanor undertook a second honeymoon, dining with New York Tribune publisher Whitelaw Reid in Europe, visiting friends of Eleanor's parents in Scotland, and making briefer trips to Paris, Milan, Verona, Venice, Dolomites, Switzerland, and the Black Forest. This trip lasted more than 3 months. During Christmas 1905, Sarah told the couple she was building a townhouse for them, with Sarah buying an expensive plot on East 65th Street the following year. Architect Charles A. Platt was hired to draw a plan for two adjoining houses for both the couple and herself. FDR worked with the architect, builder, and decorators. Franklin found Eleanor in tears one evening shortly after they moved in. FDR avoided more arguing by pretending the problem didn't exist, a habit which he would carry into his public life. Sarah gifted Eleanor and Franklin a second house, a 34-room, three-story cottage on the Cumbello shoreline. Sarah, transferring the full title to her son, called the matter a belated wedding gift. Eleanor viewed the home as a godsend and never tired of the house, rearranging things and viewing the home as having great charm due to its lack of a telephone and electricity and having a coal stove for cooking. Between Franklin and Eleanor, the couple had a trust fund income of over $12,000, which Smith cites as equivalent to $240,000 after tax dollars 100 years later. Even with this money, the couple still did not have enough for their lifestyle, which consisted of living in 3 different houses during various seasons of the year, employing at least 5 servants at all times, keeping a yacht and multiple smaller boats, automobiles, carriages, fashion, being in expensive clubs, traveling often, and giving large contributions to political and charitable causes. Sarah subsidized the pair, with her grandson Elliot remembering Granny was generous to a fault. Whenever father needed help, he had only to ask for it, and he usually had no need to ask because Granny anticipated what he or mother wanted and was ready with a check, cash, or a gift in kind. FDR passed the New York bar examination during his 3rd year at Columbia, and this was soon followed by Roosevelt being admitted to a practice, the latter dropping his courses at Columbia and never taking a degree from the school. Eleanor differed from Sarah in delegating the raising of her children to various nurses and caregivers, later admitting this was a mistake that, had she not implemented, my subsequent troubles would have been avoided and my children would have had far happier childhoods. Mirroring his own father, FDR left child rearing to his wife, although he would enjoy roughhousing with them when they were older, which included taking them for rides at Hyde Park and sailing at Cumbello. Daughter Anna remembered, "Father was fun. He would sometimes romp with me on the floor or carry me around on his shoulders. FDR would be adored by his children, who called him Pa, and saw him as the favorite uncle who entertained them, while their mother was the disciplinarian." Clark said that FDR made politics his profession and adopted it deliberately and constantly enjoyed it, just as one enjoys a game that one has always liked and learned to play well. FDR's friend Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. claimed that had Roosevelt not gone into politics, he would have been just another corporate lawyer who summered in Newport and hibernated on Wall Street. FDR remembered political lightning striking in the summer of 1910 as he was taken from the streets of Poughkeepsie and taken to a picnic for the Dutchess County. He remarked, "On that joyous occasion of claims and sauerkraut and real beer, I made my first speech, and I have been apologizing for it ever since." Mack told Roosevelt that the Democrats were in trouble in Dutchess County, as incumbent Democratic Assemblyman Louis Stuyvesant Chandler wanted to retire. The 2nd Assembly District, a safe seat for Democrats, led Roosevelt to be surprised by his good fortune. Mack suggested Roosevelt spend some weekends in Poughkeepsie to acquaint himself with local Democrats. President of the First National Bank of Poughkeepsie, Edward E. Perkins, 2 weeks later invited Roosevelt to a dispersal sale of high-grade gurneys on the Reese Farm in Wappinger Falls. Perkins confirmed that Chandler would not run again, and after hesitating, Roosevelt agreed to run. Smith elaborates, "If the New York legislative seat was certain for the Democrats, why was the party leadership so eager to bestow it on a neophyte like FDR? The decision was not as bizarre as it might appear. For the men who ran the county, a seat in the New York Assembly was small potatoes. The important offices were sheriff, tax assessor, county clerk, the various town supervisors, the judge, and prosecuting attorneys, positions that levied taxes, spent money, and enforced the law. The assembly seat was a low-paying part-time job in Albany. Second, while Poughkeepsie was safely Democratic, the rural areas of the county tilted Republican. It was useful to have someone on the ticket who could appeal to conservative voters in the countryside. In 1910, all New York counties employed the party column ballot. Straight ticket voting was the rule, and successful party leaders always sought a balanced ticket, a name or two on the ballot that would reassure the district's farmers and small-town residents. At the national level, that traditionally dictated the choice of presidential running mates, FDR's 1932 selection of John Nance Gardner, for example. And the same calculus applied at the county level. The Roosevelt name was a tremendous drawing card, and the Democratic Roosevelt in the ticket might galvanize the rural voters of Dutchess County. Finally, electoral campaigns were expensive even in 1910, and FDR, or at least Sarah, had deep pockets. Sarah favored Franklin running. As the risk of political life, the winner takes all aspects of campaigns, and the high stakes rewards all appealed to her instincts. Roosevelt discussed the matter with Eleanor, who he did not ask the approval of. He was concerned of TR getting involved, the former president having returned from a 12-month safari in East Africa and had trashed the Empire State's politics. FDR used Bammy to relay his concern to TR, who said Franklin ought to go into politics without the least regard as to where I speak or don't speak. In mid-September, weeks before the Democrats were to hold their nominating caucus, Chandler announced he was in fact running for re-election. Republican incumbent Senator John E. Schlosser was a famous lawyer, experienced campaigner, and president of the State Volunteer Firemen Association. Roosevelt persevered, exuding confidence in victory as he told the Democratic caucus in Poughkeepsie, I accept this nomination with absolute independence. I am pledged to no man. I am influenced by no special interest. In the coming campaign, I need not tell you that I do not intend to stand still. We are going to have a very strenuous month, and we have little to fear from the results on November 8th. He opened his campaign with the Bank Square rally at the center of Senator Schlosser's home. With Election Day only a month away, Roosevelt sought to cover the most ground by renting a red, open-top Maxwell car. Smith writes that campaigning by automobile was risky as cars were still a luxury in New York, and using one might remind voters of FDR's silk stocking pedigree. They also worried of getting into an accident, as horses tended to be frightened by automobiles. FDR invited Richard E. Connell, the Poughkeepsie News Press editor, to accompany him on the campaign trail. Roosevelt, Connell, and Hawkey spent each day on the roads of Dutchess, Putnam, and Columbia counties, giving speeches sometimes 10 times a day, and Roosevelt had the time of his life jumping into crowds, pumping hands, and making friends. Roosevelt cared little for the size of gatherings, once startling a group of Italian railroad workers repairing a track by leaping from his car. Roosevelt's speech-making was awkward, but he was recognized as having an uncanny ability to persuade his audience. Roosevelt served as his own campaign manager, ordering 2,500 campaign buttons, designing hundreds of posters for storefront windows through the district, and personally writing checks for advertisements he placed in each of the county newspapers. His platform was personal and substanceless. Roosevelt later admitting that he made no promises in regards to particular legislation. He aligned himself with good government and blasted the rotten corruption of the New York legislature and the extravagant mismanagement of the state administration. 1910 was a positive year for the Democratic Party. The Democrats picked up 10 seats in the United States Senate and more than half of the governorships, which included Princeton President Woodrow Wilson, New Jersey. They also won a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time in 18 years. FDR's benefits also came from Theodore Roosevelt's re-entry into political life, the latter having taken up cudgels for reform, attacked the party's old guard, and split the Republican Party in half. FDR capitalized on this split by attacking bosses in both parties and called Governor Hughes one of the best governors the state has ever had. FDR voted early on Election Day and returned to Springwood. Smith writing that the returns made it apparent that the state and the nation were undergoing one of those defining moments when political power passes from one party to the other. Republican gubernatorial candidate Henry Stimson was crushed in his bid for governor. Hamilton Fish was upset by Richard Connell in their congressional race, and FDR carried more than 2/3 of the precincts and over 1,000 more votes than Schlosser. Aside from this overwhelming Democratic victory, FDR was also benefited by having outspent Schlosser 5-1, campaigning more and out-organizing him, and leading the entire Democratic ticket. Smith writes, at the age of 28, Roosevelt had found his calling. He passed out 24 expensive cigars to friends and relatives and settled in to savor his victory. It was a singular personal triumph. He had run strongly in the rural reaches of the district, where party professionals had thought he had little chance, and the pros took notice. When Big Tim Sullivan, the Tammany wheelhouse who presented the Bowery in the Senate, heard that TR's cousin was going to be a colleague, he told friends, if we've caught a Roosevelt, we'd better take him down and drop him off the dock. The Roosevelts run true to form, and this kid is likely to do for us what the Colonel is going to do for the Republican Party, split it wide open. The New York legislators, earning $1,500 a year, had most of its members either commuting or staying in one of the hotels or boarding houses catered to transient lawmakers. Roosevelt went to Albany to find a home and found a 3-story brownstone situated on a 1-acre lot at 248 State Street. The Democratic-controlled legislature convened on January 4th, led by 37-year-old Al Smith, a 7-term veteran who, despite an 8th-grade education, had demonstrated a political savvy that catapulted him ahead of a legion of better-educated, more seasoned legislators. Their first order of business was electing a United States Senator, the Tammany candidate being former political boss of Erie County Lieutenant Governor and Assembly Speaker William F. Sheehan. Despite strong support, Sheehan aroused the hatred of Cleveland Democrats who opposed political bosses despite being far more hidebound and conservative themselves. FDR sided with the Cleveland crowd. Smith writes that like TR before him, FDR was itching for a fight. It was a matter of publicity and power, not policy or substance. Tammany had the advantage as it controlled more than 58 votes, a majority of the caucus, and this would make the vote of the caucus unanimous. The legislature met in a joint session the following morning, with Sheehan receiving 91 votes from the Democratic caucus, while all 86 Republicans supported Depew, and the rest of Democratic votes split among sentimental favorites. This meant no candidate received 101 votes required for election. The next 10 weeks saw battle lines harden and the legislature halt in any progress. Veteran newsman Lewis Howe reported, "Never in the history of Albany have 21 men threatened such total ruin of machine plans." Although Roosevelt was not the instigator or organizer of this organization, he emerged as its spokesperson and informal chair, making himself available to the press and lacking political baggage from past campaigns. His name evoked fascination with reporters in comparisons to TR. Roosevelt's house became the insurgent headquarters. The Sheehan fight gave Eleanor her first taste of political life, the latter reflecting it was a wife's duty to be interested in whatever interested her husband, whether it was politics, books, or a particular dish for dinner. That was the attitude with which I approached the first winter in Albany. Eleanor became involved with viewing proceedings from the Senate gallery, in addition to entertaining insurgents at home and preparing drinks and snacks. She also formed friendships with Tom Grady and Tim Sullivan, veteran Tammany Poles, who thought she was delightful. Smith observes that Eleanor enjoyed the practical politics of FDR's first year in the state capitol, and one of her biographers asserts, Franklin's entrance into politics saved them both from the kind of ordinary upper-class life, vapid and fatuous, that ER associated with society, at least that part of society where she had never felt welcome, comfortable, or understood. Although the legislature had been in session for 10 weeks, not a single substantive measure had been passed. After Smith and Wagner promised no reprisals, the insurgents broke ranks and the majority voted for O'Gorman's approval. Roosevelt decided further resistance was futile, although later claimed they would have taken Justice O'Gorman at the very beginning and been perfectly satisfied. 2 days after the Albany vote, FDR addressed the YMCA of Greater New York and announced, "I have just returned from a big fight, a fight that went 64 rounds. This fight was a free-for-all, and many of the other side got good and battered. The battle ended in harmony, and we have chosen a man for the people who will be dictated to by no one." The public had forgotten how ignominiously the insurgents had lost and remembered Sheehan had not been elected. FDR seeing this as gospel and never shying from retelling the tale of his first political victory. Roosevelt received national publicity from the Sheehan fight and was seen by some as a youthful symbol of political reform, with the Cleveland plain dealer pondering, may it not be possible that this rising star may continue the Roosevelt dynasty? Franklin D. Roosevelt is, to be sure, a Democrat, but this is a difference of small import. In other respects, he seems to be thoroughly Rooseveltian. The Sheehan struggle would see Roosevelt labeled anti-Catholic and anti-Irish, with Reverend Patrick Ludden claiming that Roosevelt and others reflected a resurgence of the know-nothingism old spirit that had prevented Catholics from getting ahead. Smith writes that the Roosevelts shared the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic prejudices of their time and class, noting that FDR would eventually learn tolerance and partner with America's Irish Poles for each other's mutual benefit. Smith writes that fighting bossism was natural for FDR, who challenged Tammany over a bill that would reorganize the State Highway Commission, in addition to proposing an adoption of a direct primary bill and opposing measures Tammany had supported like Sunday baseball, legalized prize fighting, and betting at the racetrack. Smith writes that although these positions were popular with Roosevelt's constituency of Upper River farmers and small-town businessmen who were church members, they ignored the economic issues of the day, failed to address the growing problems of industrialization, and tagged Tammany with an out-of-date label more appropriate to the days of the Tweed Ring than the progressive leadership of Murphy, Wagner, and Smith.